Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thank you for coming. My name is Amy Draves, and I'm pleased to welcome Jordan Ellenberg to the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Jordan's here to discuss his book, How Not to Be Wrong, in which he tells us how to use math to extend our common sense and to see through to the true meaning of information we often take for granted. He is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and lectures around the world on his research in number theory. He has been featured on the Today Show and NPR, and his writing has appeared in numerous publications, including The Wired, The New York Times, and The Washington Post. He is the author of the Slate column, Do the Math. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Well, thanks so much. It's great to be here. This is my first visit to Microsoft Research. So on the way here, actually, I was chatting with the fellow next to me on the airplane, as one does, and he said, like, well, what are you traveling for? I said, well, I'm giving talks about a book I wrote. He said, what's the book about? I said, it's about math. And then he said, so what makes your book different from all those other books by those math guys? And well, I hadn't really been expecting the conversation to take an aggressive turn so early. So I pretended to fall asleep, as one does. And while I was pretending to sleep, I thought about what I should have said to this guy who is now somewhere else. So I will, maybe I'll sort of say it to you. I mean, one thing that I tried to do in this book, How Not to Be Wrong, which you kind of can't do in a more standard journalistic 1,200 word at a time format, is to really trace out all the crazy connections between all the parts of math, the way it is many things, but it's also one thing, everything together in a big network, which I think is, for people who do math, is so much one of the characteristic features of the subject, its underlying unity. What this means is that the book kind of goes all over the place and is about a lot of different things. So to kind of talk about the book project in a short talk is not really possible. I would have to say sort of like 10 seconds about a lot of different things. So maybe just for the first slide, I'll just say some of the things I won't talk about in this talk. But we can talk about it after if you want to. The Laffer curve and taxation, the triumph of mediocrity, which was sort of an old school piece of business physics that people were interested in the 30s. The sort of questionable nature of public opinion. The existence of God. There's actually a lot of that in the book, sort of more than I expected there to be when I started writing it. The soup you get into when you start thinking about negative numbers and their proportions. False assumptions of linearity, the Supreme Court, David Hilbert, Derek Jeter. Those three are sort of all one thing that are connected. And I could have put sort of the theory of umpiring in there too, which is sort of the glue that draws that together. But I figured that in this context, it was probably better just to tell one story. And so that's what I'm going to do. And even this story, I'll sort of only tell part of it. So the story I want to tell has to do with the lottery. And I think if I click on this, it's not going to play a movie, but I'm just going to check what happens if I click on it. OK. This works as a still picture too. Actually, to tell the truth, so this is a picture of the drawing from a lottery called the Massachusetts Cash Windfall. Really, the only reason to play the movie is because it's good to sort of enjoy the kind of comedy Boston accents that you hear when you hear the drawing of the Mass Lottery. But those of you who have been in Massachusetts can just imagine it. So what this is a picture of is actually the very last Cash Windfall drawing that took place in February of 2012. And the point of the story is to talk about why this was the very last time that Cash Windfall was played. And the mathematical notion that I'm trying to explicate with this particular story is the notion of expected value. So let me quickly sort of either tell or remind you about that. So how does the lottery work? We all know a ticket costs a certain amount, and you have a small chance of winning a big prize. In this case, I mean the prize is sort of not so big, just that we don't have to have large numbers on the board. Maybe there's a 1 in 200 chance that you'll win $300. How do we think about how this lottery works? Well, if you play once, probably you'll get nothing. Maybe you'll get a large prize. But if you play a lot, and people who play the lottery often do play a lot, let's say you play 1,000 times. Let's say you play every day for about 3 years. Well, if you have a 1 in 200 chance of winning, you'll probably win about 5 times out of those 1,000 plays, which means that you'll take home about $1,500. And one way to think of that is if you've played 1,000 times and won $1,500, you've won about $1.50 per ticket. So this kind of relatively unobjectionable computation underlies what we mean when we talk about expected value. The expected value is simply the amount you expect to win per ticket. But I want to point out, this is one of these moments that occurs again and again where the mathematical use of a word sort of pulls away from the ordinary English use, something that causes sort of so much trouble when we speak with civilians, right, about mathematics, that the expected value is not at all the value you expect the ticket to have, as the notation might suggest. You don't expect the ticket to be worth $1.50. Indeed, the ticket cannot be worth $1.50. That's not even a possible value the ticket can have. It's either worth nothing or it's worth $300. So somehow, if we could go back to the dawn of mathematical notation, we would probably call this something more like average value. Because that's really what it represents. It represents the average over many plays, whether it's many plays by a single person over a long period of time, or many plays by many, many, many players at a single time, for a single drawing. And in particular, let me remark on the sort of fundamental inequality going on here. $1.50 is less than $2. That's important. $2 is how much you are charged for the ticket, and $1.50 is on average how much you're going to win. And the expected value is less than the cost. And lotteries are usually like this. Let me explain why. Because I may say, well, maybe I don't care about the average. Maybe I'm not buying 1,000 tickets. Maybe I'm only buying 1. But the state does care about the average, right? Because the state is placing lots of those lottery bets on the other side, thousands upon thousands. And if the state is on average handing out $1.50 for each $2 it takes in, then the state is making money, which is, after all, the point of the lottery. A lottery which, on average, gave money from the state to the players would not be doing what a lottery is supposed to do, which is raise revenue. So let me show you. So as I said, this is very typical of real-life lotteries. Let me show you the prize matrix for a real lottery. And this is sort of the basic prize structure for Massachusetts Cash Windfall, the game we started with. And what these numbers literally are doesn't matter so much. I just wanted to show you that I did look them up. And what you can check is that the expected value of this $2 ticket, I mean, you would be delighted if it were $1.50. It's in fact much less. It's about 80 cents. So this is what you would call a pretty bad play for the player and a pretty good play for the state. So here's the situation. Massachusetts had this lottery. The jackpot probability was set quite low. Nobody won for a year. People were getting demoralized and depressed. People were not playing. And that's bad if you're the state. I mean, if you really can't take their money if they don't play. So the state decided to change the rules. Here's the rule, and they introduced a thing called the roll down, which worked like this. They said, well, the jackpot is getting bigger and bigger. Maybe that should be enticing, but when nobody wins, people get depressed and demoralized. Instead, let's say when the jackpot hits a certain threshold, when it goes over $2 million, there's going to be a roll down. That means if nobody wins the jackpot, instead of money just kind of piling into the pot, that money rolls down to enrich the lower tier prizes to make them worth more money. Those prizes that you actually might feel you have a much better chance of winning. Maybe I'll look back for a second. You know, for instance, this match 4 out of 6, which you have a 1 in 800 chance in winning, a prize like that, maybe you've never won, but you probably know somebody who's won it if you know a lot of people who play the lottery. That's sort of somehow within the realm of realistic possibility. So this was Massachusetts' plan to make a lottery that seemed like a better deal for the player. And it worked. It worked too well. Because what Massachusetts had done, inadvertently, is made a lottery which actually was a good deal for the player. Which is not. So let me show you what the windfall payoff matrix looked like on February 7th, 2005. So it looked like this. That 4 out of 6 prize, which used to be worth $150 on a normal non-roll-down day, on this day, with the extra enrichment of all that jackpot money, was worth almost $2,500. So that's pretty good. If you have a 1 in 800 chance of making about $2,400, that is $3 worth of expected value right there for your $2 ticket. And in fact, the expected value of the $2 ticket on the roll-down day was about $5.50. So this, I mean, it's pretty good. Now, you're allowed to get out and check your phones and see if any of these games are currently being played. They're not, I checked. So why do I know the exact value of the payoffs on this particular day, February 7th, 2005? It's because I got them from the following document, which is probably a little hard to read here, but it's not so important that you can read it. Let me just tell you what it is. This is a 27-page report from Gregory W. Sullivan, who is the Inspector General of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, writing to the state treasurer to explain just what the heck had happened with their lottery game. And I have to say, it's kind of an amazing story, and I'll tell part of it today. This is definitely the only state fiscal oversight document written by a municipal bureaucrat which will make you ask, does somebody have the movie rights to this? It's really pretty amazing. And what happened, well, you can kind of imagine what happened. What happened is that pretty quickly after the introduction of this game, which they had borrowed this game from a game in Michigan, which also called Windfall, which had closed down. Pretty soon after the introduction of this game, people started to catch on to what this game actually was. So let me tell you a little bit about the sort of main characters. The main group I write about is a group of players called Random Strategies. And these were a group of MIT undergraduates led by a fellow called James Harvey, who, by an incredible stroke of good luck, was in his senior year writing an independent study project about the expected value of lottery games. When this game was launched in January 2005, so as sort of part of his project, he was like, well, let me compute it for each game offered by the state of Massachusetts. And then, presumably his pencil fell out of his hand. And, and he got a bunch of friends together, which at MIT, you can get a bunch of friends together who can compute expected value. And these guys got together and started making large bets. So in fact, the reason that we know the payoffs for that exact date, February 7th, 2005, is that was the day where James Harvey and Yuron Liu bought $14,000 worth of lottery tickets at a Star Market in Cambridge, right by MIT, which was their first big play. Another group was the group led by a guy called Jerry Selby, who's a retired engineer from Michigan. He sort of had about 30 of his family members in on this. I actually mentioned Michigan a minute ago. Do you guys remember why? Why did I mention it? So this was a guy, this was like the veteran. This guy had been doing the same thing in Michigan for 2 years until they closed down the game. And then, I mean, you can imagine his incredulity and joy when 6 months later he read that another state was opening the same game. And immediately he and his wife got in their car and drove to Deerfield, Massachusetts, in the corner of the state, which I think is geographically the closest Massachusetts convenience store to the state of Michigan. And they started playing orders. And then there was a whole other group called the Dr. Jong Lottery Club of like biomedical researchers who bought a lot of tickets down in Quincy. So all of these guys were playing this game like mad until rather late in the game, on a typical roll-down day, about 80 to 90% of all of the tickets being purchased in the lottery were being purchased by a member of one of these three groups. So each group was typically making plays of about 200,000 tickets at a time. So what's the end is a bit anticlimactic. The end of this story looks kind of like this. It looks like a front page story in the Boston Globe explaining what was going on with the Massachusetts State Lottery. This is called A Game with a Windfall for a knowing few. And as soon as this story runs, the game doesn't end immediately, but basically the game is up. Because for this to work, it does actually require that people are playing not on the roll-down days. It requires that the sort of general public has some confidence in the game. Running a lottery is in some sense a very psychological enterprise. You have to convince people to play. And once people get the sense that the lottery is somehow not quite on the level, then it's all over. So the last drawing I showed you takes place just a few months after this expose by the Boston Globe takes place. So that's the basic story. I tell it in somewhat more detail in the book. And actually, maybe I'll just say one thing that was amazing that happened. I was talking about this stuff in a bookstore in Palo Alto, gosh, I guess just 2 nights ago. And Yuron Liu came to the bookstore, and I met him. That was, I mean, you don't often get a chance for like a character in your book to like show up at the reading, and it was very weird. It would be like if somebody from Narnia like came up and was like, "Well, let me tell you how it really went down." So that was extremely amazing. So anyway, yes, they are real people. I can now verify it from my eyesight. Anyway, what I want to talk about is 2 mathematical puzzles that this story presents us with. One has an easy answer, one has a more complicated and mathematically richer answer. So puzzle 1 is, how could anybody possibly get away with this? I mean, remember, the state lottery knows who wins, right? Because they have to pay. So they know that, like, oh, interesting, like 1,000 winning tickets were like sold at the same store. And that happened last time too, and also the time before that. I mean, this is not, it somehow doesn't seem to take Sherlock Holmes to sort of figure out that something non-normal is going on in the play of the lottery. But this puzzle, which sounds hard, actually has an easy answer. So the answer is that the state did figure it out, and I think it's quite safe to say that the state knew almost from the very beginning exactly what was going on with this lottery. In fact, one reason we know that is that we know that James Harvey went to the state lottery office immediately upon doing this computation and said, hey, so given the way this lottery is structured, my plan is to get as many people to loan me money as I can and then buy tens or hundreds of thousands of tickets and make lots of money. Is that legal? Because you guys probably know kids who went to MIT, or some of you went to MIT. These are kind of good, like rule-abiding, good student types of people, right? Okay, maybe the MIT people disagree with that assessment. Anyway, well, okay, this guy was like that anyway. And we don't actually know what happened in this conversation on the lottery side, but it must have been something like, go ahead, knock yourself out. Because a week later, he and his friends make their first play. So that puzzle creates a sub-puzzle. If the state knew about it all the time, why did they allow it to go on? Like, what kind of casino allows a player to come in and beat the house week after week for a period of 7 years? And they end up taking, by the way, about $3.5 million in winnings from the state over the course of this whole thing. Well, I will explain this with a very sophisticated diagram that looks like this. See, let me explain how the lottery looks from the viewpoint of the state. A $2 ticket is sold, and Massachusetts takes 80 cents out. And that's the state's revenue from the lottery ticket. And that 80 cents is going to go to pay police officers and fund schools and pay the salaries of state university math professors and other absolutely critical functions of state government. That's what, and the other $1.20, that is going to go back in prizes. The state doesn't keep that. So what that means is that the state doesn't care who wins. Doesn't matter. The state only cares how many people play the game. If these guys are coming in and buying hundreds of thousands of extra tickets, that is a win for the state. So one way to think of it is that the flow of money here is not really from Massachusetts to Random Strategies. It's from the other players to Random Strategies, with Massachusetts taking a cut at every stage. So really, I think the way this was played out in the newspapers, in the Globe and in other places when this was being revealed, was that Random Strategies and the other big bettors were somehow beating the house. But what were they actually doing? They had found a bet that had a positive expected value, and they were making it again and again and again. They were making it in such large volume that they were very reliably winning money. So if that's what you're doing, then you are the house. That's who Random Strategies was, and the regular lottery players were like the players at the casino. So who's Massachusetts in this scenario? Who's the state? Well, I think the easiest way to say it is that the state is the state. I mean, here's another very sophisticated picture, which I think is a pretty much an exact analogy. If Random Strategies is the house and the regular lottery players are like players, well, what does the state do? The state kind of puts its hand out and collects a certain percentage of each transaction, and that's what states are good at. States don't like to gamble. States like to collect taxes. And that, in essence, is what Massachusetts was doing. They had sort of, you could think of what they were doing with this game as sort of licensing a virtual casino and then collecting a tax on each bet. So in the end, the Inspector General estimated that Massachusetts drew about an extra, I think in total they drew about $120 million in revenue from this game over its lifespan. And I think it's fair to say that if you walk away with $120 million, you were not the one getting scammed. So that's one puzzle, which I think, and as I say, I think the answer is pretty simple. I couldn't quite get, if I were a real reporter, I probably would have, I mean, I called the Massachusetts Lottery PR people, and they said, of course we didn't know any of this was going on. Obviously that's a lie, and if I were a real reporter, I could probably prove that, but I'm not a real reporter, I'm a math professor. So I'll just report that they say that's not true, but it is true. So here's the other puzzle. Okay, so there is actually a difference between Random Strategies and the other two teams, and it's the reason why I focus on Random Strategies in the book, and it's because they actually did do something rather differently from the other teams. The other teams used what's called the quick pick machine, which I don't know if you guys know. Are there a lot of lottery players? Who plays the lottery? Oh my God, a lot of liars work here. Okay, I'm going to pretend that you guys don't know what the quick pick machine is and tell you that it is a machine that will just print out a random ticket for you with random numbers, which, if you're going to buy 200,000 tickets, is an extreme convenience and labor-saving device. But the guys from Random Strategies did not do this. They filled out their tickets themselves by hand, 200,000 tickets. Why? That's the puzzle. Especially because if you know how expected value works, you know that the expected value of every ticket is exactly the same. So that the expected value of 200,000 tickets, it doesn't matter which tickets they are. The expected value just is what it is. So how could it have possibly been worth their while to take the incredibly tedious task on of filling out all these tickets by hand? That's the puzzle. So I'm going to take the rest of the time and just talk about the answer to that question. And something that we do in math when we're trying to understand something that's kind of mysterious is we take a problem that faces us and try to replace it with something much smaller and simpler. Hopefully, when we do that, we don't throw out the features we're actually interested in. Hopefully we keep them, but on a smaller scale. So what I'm going to talk about is a much smaller lottery, which for reasons I was unable to figure out is often called the Transylvanian lottery. And in this lottery, instead of 46 different numbers, like in the Cash Windfall, there's only 7 different numbers. And instead of pulling 6 balls out of the cage like you do in Cash Windfall, you only pull 3. And that reduces the total number of possible jackpot combinations to a very small, manageable number. In fact, so small that I've written them all on this board. Here are all the ways, the 35 ways of choosing 3 numbers out of 7. So for the binomial theorem fans, that is the binomial coefficient called 7 choose 3, or 35. And let me also kind of simplify the prize structure of this game so that we can kind of see how to think about it. In the Transylvanian lottery, there's only 2 kinds of prizes. There's the jackpot. That's what you get if you hit all 3 numbers. And if you only hit 2 out of the 3, you get a lesser prize, which let's call it a deuce to remind it to the number 2. So for instance, if the jackpot winning combination is 137, if your ticket says 137, then you have the jackpot, right? You have it exactly right. If it says 127, you have a deuce. And if you have 145, that overlaps in only one place with the winning ticket, and so you get nothing. So this is how this lottery works. So what do we do if we're making a big play in this game? We don't have to buy 200,000 tickets to make a big play in the rather small Transylvanian lottery. In fact, just to sort of set ideas, let's say a big player just buys 7 tickets. So let me show you what it would look like. So here's a computation. I think I won't do this on the screen, but I will just tell you that the expected number of deuces if you buy 7 tickets is it's actually 2.4. It's between 2 and 3. And if you look at what happens if you choose 7 tickets at random and see how many of these deuce prizes you expect to win, here's what it looks like. And so you can see, just as you might expect, the most likely outcomes are that you get either 2 or you get 3. But you might get completely shut out. It's not that likely, and you might actually do great and happen to have like lots more deuces among your 7 tickets. So what I want to show you now is a different way of choosing the 7 tickets, one that is not at all random, but one that is chosen quite carefully. So here's my 7 tickets. These are the 7 tickets I buy when I play the Transylvanian lottery. And maybe just to sort of show you what is special about these, this will be like the audience participation portion of the program. If one of you guys can be the cage and give me like a random set of 3 numbers between 1 and 7, that would be great. You can just shout it out. I don't care where it comes from.
429.
Okay, I'm going to give somebody else a chance. 127. I heard 127. Okay, so let's look and see how I did. If the jackpot comes at 127, okay, I hope I win the jackpot. No, I didn't. Okay, too bad. I'm out of luck. But let's see. I do have that 123, so I get a deuce from that. And I have a 247, so I'm going to get a deuce there. And I have 167. I get a deuce from there. And then I think everything else is a no prizer, right? So I got 3 deuces. Okay, now another. 4, 5, 6. Okay. Once again, I fail to win the jackpot. I see a 1, 4, 5. Let's see if you guys can count as fast as me. I see a 3, 4, 6. That's another deuce. And 2, 5, 6. Okay, that's a deuce too. And then I think that's it. Okay. Anybody else? We're not going to do it for that long. We got to do a few to get the idea. No. Yeah, what is it with you guys in the 9s? If it was an 8, I would understand, but it's the Anybody else? 1, 5, 6. I had 1, 5, 6. Okay, so I've got a deuce with a 1, 4, 5, and I've got a deuce with a 1, 6, 7, and I have 2, 5, 6 is a deuce again for that one, and then I think that's it. Okay, so what happened here? You guys threw out 3 random numbers, and each time I got 3 deuces. And that's no coincidence. In fact, there's something quite remarkable about this set of numbers. It has the property that no matter what numbers are drawn, there's only 2 things that can happen. Either I win the jackpot, that's certainly possible if it's one of my 7 numbers that it's drawn. But if it's any of the other 28 numbers, I get exactly 3 deuces. Now, why is that good? Let me explain from a financial point of view why that's good. Then I'll explain from a geometric point of view what's going on. The reason it's good from a financial point of view is that by choosing these numbers, I've instituted what's called a hedge. I've hedged away my risk. The expected value doesn't change. And yet I've eliminated the possibility that I will get either 0, 1, or 2 deuces. Either I get the jackpot or I get 3 deuces. Now, for the expected value to get the same, if I get rid of my risk, it means I have to give something up at the top, right? It means I give away the possibility of really making a lot of money on each play. But in this kind of game, in this kind of context, that is usually considered a good. Given options with the same expected value, if that expected value is positive, you usually want to diminish your risk. And the reason that you want to, well, imagine if your business model is that you are asking everybody in your MIT dorm to give you all the money they have, and you're going to go buy lottery tickets with it. If you lose all that money, and then you come back and say, but statistically speaking, we're likely to come out ahead in the long run if you give me more money, that is sort of, for sociological reasons, like not such a winning play. So if you're sort of playing with somebody else's money, if you're relying on borrowing, it's really quite a good thing to hedge away the risk if you can. And this is sort of the key to the puzzle. By choosing the numbers yourself, by not allowing it to do randomly, the expected value is the same, but you can make the risk completely go away. Now let me show you why it works with a picture, because it comes from a somewhat unexpected source. So what is this? It looks like a triangle. But what I want to say is that this is not a triangle. This is the plane. OK, what do I mean by that? Maybe it's better to say it is a plane. But it's a funny kind of plane. It's a plane with only 7 points. They are marked and numbered here. It's a plane which has only 7 points, and also which has only 7 lines. Most of them look like lines on the page, but one of them does not. One of them is this little circle thing. But I'm just going to kind of aggressively say that those 7 numbers, those black circles, are points, and all those little curves I've drawn are lines. And then you will note that the 7 tickets I bought precisely correspond to the 7 lines. So like here's 1, 2, 3 along the bottom, and that's one of my tickets. Here's 1, 6, 7, which is another one of my tickets. This circular one is 2, 5, 6, which is one of my tickets. And if you went through each one and looked at what points were on it, there's 3 points on each line, and then looked at the 7 tickets I bought, you would see that they exactly matched. OK, well, anybody can draw a picture. Why do I say this is the plane? Because to a modern geometer, geometry is defined by axioms. In other words, we say, what are points? What are lines? Well, points are things which behave the way points behave, and lines behave in the way that lines behave. So in particular, why do I say these things are points and lines? Well, what are the rules of points and lines? It is that any 2 points are contained in a single line, and any 2 lines intersect in a single point. And if you sort of contemplate this for a while, you could check it exhaustively if you wanted to, you will see that those things are literally true. If I choose any 2 points in this diagram, there is a unique line between them. In other words, they behave just as lines are supposed to behave. And if you choose any 2 lines in this diagram, there is a single point where they meet. Now, by the way, that is actually not exactly the way that lines behave in our usual plane geometry. What's the difference? Did anybody see the subtle difference? Yes. In regular geometry, like we learned in the 9th grade, we don't say any 2 lines intersect in a unique point. We say any 2 lines intersect in at most 1 point. If they're parallel, they intersect in 0 points. Otherwise, they intersect in exactly 1 point. OK, so that's kind of disgusting, right? Rules should not have exceptions. Rules are much nicer if they're like literal rules. So this geometry is, in fact, much better than Euclid's original one. And it's an example of what's called a projective geometry. So this is where, in the book, I kind of veer off into talking about Florentine painting and how people there sort of started to understand that when you paint a picture, lines that are in real life parallel on the painting actually meet at a point called the vanishing point. These guys, as much as I love math, the painters were sort of ahead of us on this point and understood much better how to make a geometry in which every pair of lines met, and there was no such thing as parallel lines. And that's the kind of geometry this geometry is. So, and in fact, maybe I'll just mention that then it sort of takes an even farther course afield, which I won't talk about in this talk, but it talks about the relationship of all this stuff to the dawn of information theory and error-correcting codes and sphere packing, which I mentioned just in order to say that I get to talk about the work of a colleague of mine, Henry Cohn, who is at the other campus of Microsoft Research over in New England, who is like one of the world's champion sphere packers. I'm sure a lot of you guys know him. So Henry appears in this book, and actually I talked to him a lot in the course of writing this chapter. So what does the geometry have to do with the magical lottery properties I just said? Well, why is it that I can guarantee that I get 3 deuces no matter what the jackpot numbers was? I think it was the last one we did 156. I think that's what it was. 156. Let's look at it. Here's 1, here's 5, and here's 6. How did I know I was going to win exactly 3 of those prizes? Well, I wonder, the question is, am I going to get a deuce from the 1 and a 6? Do I have a ticket with a 1 and a 6? I do, because there's a line through 1 and 6, and that's a ticket I have. Do I have a ticket with a 5 and a 6? I do, because there's a unique line through those two points, and that's a ticket I have. And the same for 1 and 2, through 1 and, which one didn't I say? 1 and 5. So the fact that through any 2 points there's a unique line is exactly the same as the fact that for any 2 numbers on the jackpot, I have that ticket that guarantees me a deuce. So it's precisely this geometric property that, that gives this particular choice of tickets its wonderful feature. And so that same table I showed you before, in the case of this choice of 7 tickets, looks completely different. It's so that you have an 80% chance of getting 3 deuces. And if you don't, you're guaranteed the jackpot. So you absolutely cannot lose. And that's because, well, I guess I have a slide for this. This is exactly because of the comment that I made about every 2 lines intersecting at a single point and every 2 points contained in a single line. So this was for the simple problem, not for the real cash windfall. What about the actual cash windfall? Unfortunately, I mean, it's not so easy to make a geometry that exactly matches 6 balls out of 46 choices. So I wrote these guys, and I was like, did you do something like this? And they wouldn't quite tell me. I was able to make contact with them, but they were like, well, we had a math guy. Like, he had an algorithm. We don't know if he wants to talk to you, blah, 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 blah. So I got kind of annoyed, and then I got kind of obsessed with like trying to figure out what these guys did. And in the end, I came across a paper from 1976 by a guy called R.H.F. Denniston in the field known as combinatorial designs. And using this very beautiful construction of his, I was able to cook up a way of buying about 220,000 tickets, which gave you a near guarantee that you would win 5 out of these 5 out of 6 prizes. So it had the expected value that all of these, that any choice of this many tickets would have, but it reduces the risk of losing almost to 0. So I don't know if this particular combinatorial design is what they used or if they used something like this at all. But if they didn't, I think they should have done. So I'll stop there. This is a picture of the book, although I guess you guys can see it behind you, so you don't need to. And I'll take questions. Thank you very much. So you had a question, I'm sorry, during
I'm actually going to ask you, how did you come up with the geometry for those 7 numbers? Even that would be helpful to understand.
Oh, so that's one of the most, that is like the sort of the beginning of the theory of combinatorial designs. And that particular picture is called the Fano plane. So it was from a guy called Gino Fano from the end of the 19th century he was one of the first people to really think about geometry in this axiomatic way. It's a point of view we sort of think of as associated with Hilbert, but Fano is one of the first. There's a quote in the book, it's in Italian, but I can't remember it in English either. But it basically says, he sort of very forcefully says, like, well, when I say a point in a line, I mean things that obey the axioms, and we have to sort of free ourselves from this tyranny of thinking about what things look like on the page and work in this sort of completely abstract realm of like which things obey the rules of points and lines. And that was what enabled him to make this, this kind of progress. So for the fans of finite fields in the room, and I'm sure there are some, another way to describe this thing is that it's the projective plane over the finite field of 2 elements. That's what we would call it today. I'm not sure if Fano himself thought of it that way, but that's the way a modern kind of number theorist or geometer would refer to it. Yeah, in the back.
What surprised you the most when you were writing the book?
What surprised me the most, I mean, I knew that I liked to go on, but I didn't really understand how much. Because when you start to research this stuff, everything connects to something else, and you're like, oh my god, this is crazy, how can I not talk about this? So I submitted a proposal when I sold this book originally that had 18 chapters, and then at some point, I had written 3 of them, and I had about 300 pages. And so I had to have kind of a hard conversation with Penguin, where I said, do you more want an 1,800-page book that you'll get like 7 years from now? Or do you more want me just to write like 5 of these chapters? And they, I think thankfully for everyone involved with their good commercial instincts, said, we just want you to write 5 of the chapters, and that will be fine. So that's, so yeah, I mean, when you sort of go into the history and go into the connections between the different parts of math, you just fall down like infinitely many rabbit holes, and then inside each of those infinitely many rabbit holes, like another exciting rabbit, like running away down another corridor. And so I think that's what I found surprising. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. This is a good example of something that I didn't even know this story when I proposed the book. I sort of came across it while I was doing something else, and I was like, oh my god, I have to write like 75 pages about this. Yeah.
I understand where you were going with the story, but what's the broader message of your book?
Well, I think the broader message of the book is that for people who have been trained to think of mathematics as this kind of separate system, right, that takes place in its own world, that doesn't hook up with the ordinary things that we do, I think it's a very wrong way to think of it. Like, I want to show how mathematical thinking is, it's not separate. It's tied up with all the other kinds of thinking that we do. It's not something another way to say it is, it's not something we do instead of thinking. It's sort of a formalized and strengthened version of our thinking. So I could come back again and again to explaining something that to me is part of mathematics. And I'll certainly explain it mathematically and do computations and blah, blah, blah. But in the end, it's common sense. But it's a strengthened version of common sense. Yeah.
We have a question from Michael online. He says, what do you consider to be the most exciting new area of mathematics being developed today?
Oh, so I mean, it's like picking from your children. I'll just say one thing that's tremendously exciting, especially for somebody like me who comes from number theory, is what's going on in like machine learning and what you might call the new statistics. Because this is an area where, if you do number theory, you're working in an area that people have been mining for literally 2,000 years, right? It's a very old subject. There's a huge learning curve, right? Everything that's easy has been done already. If you have an idea, you get excited about it, you tell somebody, and they're like, oh, that's great, but people tried this in 1930. This happens a lot in number theory. In machine learning, you talk to these people, and it's tremendously exciting. It's a brand new field that's being created under your feet as you go. Everything is up for grabs, including like what the field should be called, what it's about, who should be doing it, et cetera, et cetera. And when you have an idea and you tell it to people, they'll say like, oh, that's a good idea, but somebody did it like 6 months ago. And I think for somebody who works in a very old field like me, there's a wonderful appeal to that kind of stuff. And I think just the fact that it's a field that we don't know what it's going to look like 5 years from now, 10 years ago, I think is tremendously exciting. Yeah, in the back.
I think when I was looking up the book online, there was a tagline that said like the freakonomics of math. Were you influenced by Dubner and Levitt and the freakonomics guys, or is that something you follow? Or?
So I signed this thing that said that this could be distributed outside Microsoft, and yet maybe I should. So it's somewhat risky to me to reveal that I have not actually read that book. Yet I'm building my own book as the freakonomics of math. Let me defend myself for doing that. So while I haven't read Freakonomics, I mean, I've read a lot of their columns and like their articles and stuff like that make up the book. And what those guys have done, and not just them, by the way, but Paul Krugman and other sort of outward-facing economists as well, it's not just that they've written their own books. It's that they've taken ideas which previously were kind of inside the academic silo of economics, and they have made them so popular that they become part of the common discourse, right? That people now, it's ordinary to read the paper and read something about incentives or read something about diminishing returns or something like that. And you read that not just in the business section or not just in something that is an economics column, but anywhere in the newspaper, right? I think all of us, and I'm just one person doing this, but all of us who are on the project of outward-facing mathematics want to take some of these mathematical notions, like expected value, like regression to the mean, like linearity, like formalism, like some of these things I talk about in the book, some of the big themes of the book, things that all mathematicians sort of know what they mean and know the sort of breadth of their explanatory force, and kind of make it safe and normal for people who are not mathematicians and not writing in the science section of the paper to use those notions in everyday life. So I think that's the sense in which I think my project is the same kind of project as the Freakonomics project. Yeah?
I have to ask this. How long prior to our flight should we be at the airport?
Yeah, so there was a sort of a weird kind of game of telephone with British newspapers where it somehow came to be common knowledge that apparently I'm an expert in airport studies. So what this refers to a section of the book where I talk about a famous old dictum of the economist George Stigler, who said that if you never miss an airplane, you're spending too much time in the airport. I'll stand by that, but what's being expressed there, am I allowed to write on this actually? Can I do this? It's just this picture. Here's the picture. This is everything you need to know. OK, there it is. That's the explanation. No, so So what does that mean? It means that in terms of your sort of the overall benefit of your strategy, if you leave in the morning for a flight that's at night, you're clearly wasting a lot of your own time, right? There's such a thing as arriving too early. And there's such a thing as arriving too late, where you're essentially certain to miss your flight. So somehow the optimum is somewhere in between, where there's some non-zero chance of missing your flight. I mean, it might be small, but it's not zero. And that's exactly what Stigler is saying. But I mean, I think somehow that got translated into people thinking I was going to say, like, here is the exact number down to the minute. And obviously that's going to vary depending on your personality, depending on context. Actually, one thing I learned from what people said about that is that there are people who actually love hanging out at the airport. I didn't know that. I thought that had negative utility for everyone. But apparently, there are people who are like, but then you get to shop at the duty-free shop. The duty-free shop is terrible compared to a regular shop. I don't really understand. But I learned that a lot of people, it's like the highlight of their week to like go to the duty-free shop. And so yeah, that's all that I mean. I mean, it's the same thing I say in the book as you know, if your government doesn't waste any money, you're spending too much money fighting government waste. It's like, yeah.
Question along the same lines that he wanted to know who really did win the Florida election in 2000.
Oh, so I talk a bit about Bush versus Gore. Some of you in the room are too young to remember this, terrifyingly enough. So there were these two guys who wanted to be president anyway. So actually, I think that would have been a great moment for mathematicians to stand up and say that that question doesn't really have an answer. We really cannot know who got more votes. I think that's fair to say. And so I write about that in the book as an example of the fundamental formalism of our legal system, that I think it would have been that people probably had more pressing things to worry about, but if it had been considered an opportunity for math education, it would have been a nice time to sort of stand up and say, this is a formalist moment where we accept that we don't actually know who got more votes, and we say there's a procedure, and whatever the procedure says, that's who's president. But we don't pretend that somebody won or somebody lost in the sense of like actually got more votes. So that's why I talk about Derek Jeter and you know, the sort of famous dictum of Bill Clem, the great National League umpire, who said of the question of like, you know, do you ever miss a ball or a strike? He said, it ain't nothing till I call it. Yeah. The umpire's decision makes reality in the same way that our legal system, for better or for worse, a Supreme Court decision creates the reality. It doesn't observe reality. Yeah.
So I'm curious, what does mathematics have to say about the probability of your running into a subject from your book in a bookstore? Some other probable coincidence.
Well, I did email him, actually. When I told the story, I made it sound like he just showed up to make the story a little better. But if you're going to press me on it, yes, I emailed him to say I was going to be in Palo Alto. Yeah.
So or does your power of mathematical thinking actually ever really sort of let you down?
So one thing I try to do in the book, I mean, I think, of course, out in the world, all of us who work in quantitative fields feel that, in general, the world is not quantitatively inclined enough, right? We can't help but feel that way. At the same time, there is kind of, on the other side, a danger of what you might call math supremacy, and feeling like, in the end, we'll sort of achieve some kind of apotheosis where we can just like sort of sit and compute about stuff instead of thinking about stuff. And I think it's to the extent that that's a danger, it's important to push back on it and sort of talk about the limits. And I do that. I mean, that actually especially comes up in the parts about religion, where there's like such a long tradition of people kind of desperately and wistfully hoping that mathematics will help them find the way out of the conundrums of faith. And I think every attempt like that has completely like fallen down and failed. Like, I think that is not a question about which math gives an answer one way or the other. I mean, lots of people have said that it did. At least on my assessment, all those attempts are failures. And I think that's sort of one place in the book, which is returned to several times, where you see that we have to have math with us all the time, but not only math. Yeah.
What
So I had a really bad experience with math growing up as a kid. It was only after getting out of school and where it haunted me to such an extent that I decided to tackle it and take it on. I now have an 8-year-old son.
Oh, me too.
Okay, so and I don't want him to have the same challenges that I had when I was a kid. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on math education and how it might be improved. It seems like there's a lot of talk about that lately.
Yes, and I talk about that a little bit directly in the book, but here's what I would say. Here's one thing that makes it so hard. I think when I started out teaching and learning how to teach, I was like, I'm going to find out the best way to do this and do it, right? Because that's how we approach a lot of problems that we have to attack. And over the years, what I've come to feel is that one of the fundamental challenges of teaching is that kids are really different from each other, like really different, and there is not a best way. So sort of something that we do that's going to engage one population of kids is going to completely bore another. And so what you hated in school, there were probably other kids who liked. And something that would have worked well for you probably would have turned off somebody else. And so I think as teachers, the best that we can try to do is to kind of broadcast on all channels and do things in a lot of different ways to maximize the chance that like each student finds that thing that hooks into them, that thing that enables them to engage with the mathematics. I mean, I think it's a phenomenally hard challenge, and I think, I mean, one reason I hedge is because as somebody who teaches in a university, our teaching conditions are so completely different from somebody who's teaching 8-year-olds. They are under the constraints of knowing that their students are going to be taking like a test that has high stakes for both them and for the teacher and for the principal and for the school. So it's easy for me to say like, oh, they should do this and they should do that. But they're under very serious constraints. And I think, well, maybe one thing that's not talked about enough, we talk a lot about what the teacher should do, but in a world in which the teacher's actions are so highly constrained by the tests, I think it's important to remember that the people who write the tests have a massive amount of responsibility on their shoulders in that system to create tests that tests what we want to test. I mean, that's one thing. I think that does matter. Are we going to talk about it? I'll take one more. If we can.
This question, is there a good book for number theory for 8, 9-year-olds?
Oh, I mean, boy, that really depends on the 8 and 9-year-old. I mean, I think when I was that age, I feel like the Bible and the Torah and the Quran of my life was Gödel, Escher, Bach, which I did not understand. But I think what's amazing about that book is that it has so many different parts of so many different levels of difficulty, but all of it's deep, the easier parts and the difficult parts. So I feel like, at least for me, that was like a huge portal into like what mathematics really was. And when I was 9, I probably just read the parts with the talking animals. And then like each time, but it was fascinating, and each time I would come back to it, and each time like read more, and each time get more of the parts that I couldn't. So I would say, that's not particularly about number theory, but I would say that book, and then of course the Martin Gardner books. I mean, like, nobody has, even though those books are 50 years old, like nobody has really equaled what he did in the way of math exposition. And there's like, God knows how many, there's like 25 volumes of his Scientific American columns. I actually just bought 2 of them for my 8-year-old, so I'll report back as to whether he likes them. Oh, thank you.